April 14th, 1912. The Atlantic is a mirror of black glass, but deep within the steel bowels of the world's greatest ship, a hellish secret was already burning. While the orchestra played for the elite on the upper decks, below the waterline, in the darkness of Boiler Room Number 6, a group of men were fighting for their lives. They weren't fighting the iceberg, not yet. They were fighting an inferno that had been raging since the moment the Titanic left the docks of Southampton. But then came the order that changed everything. Seal the doors. Why were these men locked inside a burning tomb? Why was Boiler Room 6 sealed before the collision even happened? Today, we descend into the abyss to find the truth that history tried to bury. Welcome to Terra Paradox. Join the Registry of Truth. Before we reveal the sabotage, leave a signal in the comments if you believe the Titanic was doomed before she sailed. To understand the terror of Boiler Room 6, you have to understand the sheer scale of the engineering. Imagine a cavern of steel, 3 stories high, filled with the roar of 29 massive boilers. This was the heart of the Titanic. But by the 4th day at sea, that heart was suffering from a malignant fever. A coal bunker fire, specifically in bunker number 10, had been smoldering for days. The temperature was rising beyond the melting point of steel. The stokers, the forgotten laborers of the Gilded Age, were ordered to keep it quiet. Shovel the coal faster, they were told. Feed the engines with the burning debris. But as the fire ate through the coal, it began to warp the very bulkheads meant to keep the ocean out. The steel was glowing a sickly cherry red. Imagine the sound of buckling metal in the pitch black of the lower decks, the smell of burning sulfur mixing with the salt air. Then, the impact. Not a loud crash, but a soft, grinding shudder. In the upper cabins, it barely knocked a glass of champagne over. But in Boiler Room 6, it was the sound of a death sentence. The ice didn't just cut the hull, it struck the exact spot where the fire had already weakened the steel. The bulkhead shattered like glass. Icy water met white-hot coal. The explosion of steam was blinding, and then the sirens. The massive watertight doors began their slow, mechanical descent. For the men inside, the choice was simple: run or be erased. But witness accounts from survivors like stoker Frederick Barrett tell a darker story. The doors didn't just close, they were locked from the outside, leaving 12 men to face the rising tide and the falling fire alone. Why seal a room that was already failing? Was it to save the ship, or to hide the evidence of a fire that should have canceled the voyage? The official record says the ice cut a 300-foot gash through the hull, but the math of the abyss tells a different story. By the time the Titanic struck the berg, the steel in Boiler Room 6 wasn't the invincible armor White Star Line promised, it was clay. The smoldering fire in Bunker 10 had been cooking that bulkhead for over a week at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Was it a statistical impossibility or a predetermined fracture? Survivor Frederick Barrett testified that when the water hit, the bulkhead simply gave way. It didn't bend, it shattered. But there is a detail the inquiry boards in London and New York buried. A detail that explains the desperate reach of the hand in our thumbnail. The order to seal the rooms came from the bridge, but the execution happened in the dark. The men in Boiler Room 6 weren't just victims of the ocean, they were victims of a corporate lockdown. Imagine the panic, the roar of the water competing with the hiss of the steam. You are deep below the surface. The only thing between you and eternity is a 3-ton steel door, and it is closing. 12 men were listed in the duty roster for that shift. Only Barrett survived the initial surge. But what happened to the others? The telegrams sent to the families said they died heroically at their posts. The truth is, they died behind a locked gate.
Forensic analysis of the wreck shows something chilling. The latches on the doors to Boiler Room 6 were jammed from the outside. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was a human intervention. Someone, somewhere, decided that these 12 lives were the price for a few more minutes of float time. But even in their final moments, they tried to signal. Divers in the 1980s reported finding rhythmic scrapings on the inside of the bulkheads, a desperate Morse code for help, tapped out against the very steel that had been sabotaged by fire. If you can feel the weight of that iron door, then you are beginning to understand the paradox. To save a company's reputation, they chose to bury the witnesses. Behind every corporate tragedy lies a man with a stopwatch. For the Titanic, that man was J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. Ismay didn't want safety. He wanted the blue ribbon, the prize for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. But the fire in Boiler Room 6 stood in his way. The smoldering bunker fire wasn't just a nuisance, it was a ticking clock. If they stopped to put it out, the record was lost. If they continued, the ship was a bomb. History suggests a silent pact was made. Keep the fire contained, keep the speed up. We deal with the damage when we reach New York, but the steel wasn't part of the pact. By the 6th day, the bulkhead separating Boiler Room 6 from Bunker 10 was a curtain of melting iron. The stokers knew. They felt the heat through their boots. They smelled the burning sulfur. But they were told to keep shoveling, to hide the smoke from the passengers. This is where the narrative of a mechanical failure collapses. This is where the evidence of the locked doors begins to bleed through. To maintain the unsinkable lie, the lower decks had to be compartmentalized, not to save the ship, but to buy time for the lifeboats of the elite. Internal memos discovered decades later reveal that White Star officials were warned about the structural integrity of Boiler Room 6 weeks before launch. They knew the fire was burning. They knew the steel was weak. And when the ice hit, they knew exactly which room would be the first to flood. When the watertight doors were ordered shut, it wasn't a standard safety procedure. It was a tactical burial, a human barrier against a corporate mistake. Every second the stokers fought the water was a second the first class had to board their lifeboats. During the 1912 British inquiry, the question of the fire was brought up and immediately suppressed. Witnesses were coached. Testimony was altered. They called it an act of God. The survivors called it murder. Even now, 2.5 miles down, the silence of Boiler Room 6 is deafening. The truth remains under lock and key.
But the cover-up didn't end in the courtrooms of 1912. It was just the beginning of a century of silence. For 73 years, the Titanic lay in the dark, and the secret of Boiler Room 6 lay with her. When Robert Ballard finally discovered the wreck in 1985, the world was captivated by the grandeur of the bow and the tragedy of the debris field. But few looked closely at the jagged scar on the starboard side, a scar that tells a different story, a story of a fire that simply would not die. Metallurgical tests conducted on recovered hull plates from the vicinity of the fire-damaged compartments show a terrifying reality. The steel had undergone a chemical change. It had lost its ductile strength. The intense, prolonged heat of the coal bunker fire had crystallized the metal, making it brittle. This is the smoking gun that the inquiry boards tried to hide. The fire didn't just happen, it was managed until it broke the ship's backbone. Think about the psychological pressure on Captain Smith, a man at the sunset of his long career, pressured by Bruce Ismay to deliver a miracle. He knew the bunker was a furnace. He knew the bulkheads were warping. So why didn't he turn back? Why didn't he slow down in the face of ice warnings? Because in the industrial world of 1912, a late arrival was a corporate disaster. The tragedy of the Titanic isn't just about a rogue iceberg in the North Atlantic. It's about the systemic arrogance of speed over safety. And what of the men? The families of the stokers who were sealed inside that iron tomb. They were given small, insulting pensions, a pittance to ensure their silence. No public memorial in Southampton mentioned the sealed 12. They were effectively scrubbed from the official history books, replaced by the romanticized stories of the orchestra playing on deck. But we remember. We see that cold-stained hand reaching out from the darkness in the wreck footage. We hear the ghostly echo of the hammers against the bulkheads in the survivors' nightmares. The Boiler Room 6 fire is the ultimate paradox that reveals the truth about power. Power protects itself at all costs. Evidence is buried under miles of ocean, and the witnesses, they are silenced by the very doors they were told would keep them safe.
We are now approaching the final mystery, the one thing the divers found that they were told never to report. A latch that was bolted from the outside, not by a machine, but by a human hand. Someone stood in that hallway as the water rose and chose to turn the key. The time was running out, for the ship and for the men. It was the perfect storm of fire and ice, engineered by greed. The Atlantic kept their secret for over a century, but the steel has a memory, and that memory is finally screaming. Are you ready for the final reveal? The men who turned the key weren't monsters. They were engineers, led by Chief Joseph Bell. They stayed behind to keep the lights on at the price of silence.
Modern thermal imaging of the wreck reveals a massive structural failure exactly where the coal bunker fire raged, a gash that the iceberg alone couldn't have made. If the fire hadn't happened, the Titanic might have stayed afloat for hours longer, long enough for the Carpathia to arrive, long enough for everyone. But the cover-up didn't end in the courtrooms of 1912. It was just the beginning of a century of silence. For 73 years, the Titanic lay in the dark, and the secret of Boiler Room 6 lay with her. When Robert Ballard finally discovered the wreck in 1985, the world was captivated by the grandeur of the bow and the tragedy of the debris field. But few looked closely at the jagged scar on the starboard side, the scar that tells a different story, a story of a fire that simply would not die. Metallurgical tests conducted on recovered hull plates show a terrifying reality. The steel had undergone a chemical change. It had lost its ductile strength. The intense, prolonged heat of the coal bunker fire had crystallized the metal, making it brittle. This is the smoking gun that the inquiry boards tried to hide. The fire didn't just happen, it was managed until it broke the ship's backbone. Think about the psychological pressure on Captain Smith, a man at the sunset of his long career, pressured by Bruce Ismay to deliver a miracle for White Star. He knew the bunker was a furnace. He knew the bulkheads were warping. So why didn't he turn back? Why didn't he slow down in the face of ice warnings? Because in the industrial world of 1912, a late arrival was a corporate disaster more expensive than any insurance claim. The tragedy of the Titanic isn't just about a rogue iceberg in the North Atlantic. It's about the systemic arrogance of speed over safety. And what of the men? The families of the stokers who were sealed inside that iron tomb. They were given small, insulting pensions, a pittance to ensure their silence. No public memorial in Southampton mentioned the sealed 12. They were effectively scrubbed from the official history books, replaced by the romanticized stories of the orchestra playing on deck. But we remember. We see that coal-stained hand reaching out from the darkness in the wreck footage. We hear the ghostly echo of the hammers against the bulkheads in the survivors' nightmares. The Boiler Room 6 fire is the ultimate paradox that reveals the truth about power. Power protects itself at all costs. Evidence is buried under miles of ocean. And the witnesses? They are silenced by the very doors they were told would keep them safe. We are now approaching the final mystery, the one thing the divers found that they were told never to report. A latch that was bolted from the outside, not by a machine, but by a human hand. Someone stood in that hallway as the water rose and chose to turn the key. The time was running out, for the ship and for the men. It was the perfect storm of fire and ice, engineered by greed. The Atlantic kept their secret for over a century, but the steel has a memory, and that memory is finally screaming. Are you ready for the final reveal? The name of the man who gave the order? The men who turned the key weren't monsters. They were engineers, led by Chief Joseph Bell.
The men who turned the key weren't monsters in the traditional sense of the word. They were engineers, skilled professionals led by Chief Joseph Bell, a man of duty and unyielding loyalty to the White Star Line. Bell and his team of 24 engineers knew that the fire raging in Boiler Room 6 was a slow-motion death sentence for the vessel. They knew the steel was warping, and yet they were bound by a corporate mandate that prioritized the ship's lights and the wireless telegraph over human lives. To keep the electricity running, So the wealthy could send their final messages, these men stayed behind in the rising heat. But the price of that artificial light was an eternal, suffocating silence. They didn't just choose to stay, they were ordered to ensure the flood remained contained within those specific steel walls. If a frantic stoker tried to flee the rising icy water, he was met with the cold iron of the descending bulkhead, pushed back into the rising flood. The final decision wasn't made on the bridge by Captain Smith amidst the chaos of the lifeboats. No, it was made in the crushing darkness of the lower decks by men who chose the survival of a company's reputation over the lives of their own comrades. 12 souls were locked away, becoming a physical barrier of flesh and bone between the Atlantic Ocean and the pride of the White Star Line. When the ship finally surrendered to the weight of the water and split in two, the air trapped inside Boiler Room 6 didn't simply escape into the night. It imploded with a force that defies imagination. A violent, silent scream of steel echoed across the midnight ocean floor as the fire that never stopped finally met the crushing pressure of the deep abyss. We are taught that the Titanic was an unavoidable accident of nature, a tragedy of fate. But forensic evidence screams a different story. We see the clear evidence of institutionalized greed. The smoldering fire in the coal bunker was the smoking gun, the catalyst that turned a graze into a fatal wound. The locked doors were the sentence, and the freezing North Atlantic was the intended grave for the truth. If you have traveled this far into the darkness with us, you are now more than a viewer. You are a witness to the paradox. The truth is no longer buried under 2 miles of silt and water. The fire was real. The doors were bolted from the outside, and those 12 men were sacrificed as collateral damage in a corporate cover-up. Join Terra Paradox. Subscribe now to enter our registry of truth and ensure you never stay lost in the static of official history. But remember, the mystery of the boiler room was only one piece of the puzzle that night. What about the SS Californian, the ship that sat in the ice and watched the flares rise? Discover that secret in our next investigation. The static is finally ending.